He found her at a shopping mall in West Los Angeles with a pitch that sounded like a dream. There was a role in the next James Bond film, a six-figure payday, and one small instruction about what to wear to the audition. A week later, the young woman who'd taken him up on that seemingly too good to be true offer was gone. The thing that would eventually undo the man behind the offer wasn't a fingerprint or an eyewitness to the worst of it. It was a habit, the same script, repeated to one woman after another for years, until the pattern itself became the closest thing to a confession anyone would ever get. Christine Johnson, or Christy to everyone who knew her, grew up in Saugatuck, Michigan, a small town on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan. She was born in February 1981, graduated from the local high school in 1999, and spent a stretch at Western Michigan University before the pull of the film industry got the better of her. By the end of 2000, she'd relocated to the Santa Monica area, where she took classes part-time at the community college and chased work on real productions. She'd already gotten a taste of it, and in that year she landed a job on a Sandra Bullock film, though perhaps not in her ideal role in front of the camera. Some sources say that she worked as a production assistant on the set, while others claim that she was working as a personal assistant. Regardless of what she was doing precisely, one thing was clear. She was actually making some inroads to finding steady, paid work in Hollywood. On the other side of her Hollywood dream was a young woman who was close with her mother and her brother back home, the kind of daughter who called Michigan almost every day just to talk. That last detail mattered, because it's the reason anyone noticed so quickly when the calls stopped. Christy wasn't someone who'd drop out of contact or run off without a word, so when she went quiet, the people who loved her knew right away that something was wrong. On February 15th, 2003, Christy was at the mall in Century City when a well-dressed man approached her. He carried himself like someone important, a producer or a photographer, a man with connections to the Bond franchise. He told her she had exactly the look they'd been searching for, that there was a part in the next 007 film with her name on it. There was just one thing. To really sell it at the audition, she should turn up in a white blouse, a black miniskirt, sheer nylons, and stiletto heels. None of that was as bizarre as it sounds, and studios did, apparently sometimes, scout faces in public. To a young woman trying to break in, a stranger with a smooth line and a big promise wasn't automatically a warning sign. Christy bought a new pair of heels that very day, and she mentioned the audition to her roommate. Then she went off to meet him, and that was the last anyone heard from her. In a small twist of fortune for investigators, Christy would leave the receipt for the heels that she purchased in her room, giving them an exact time to work with. When Christy's mother couldn't reach her over the following days, something unheard of for the two of them, she filed a missing person report on February 18th. Her phone records told an alarming story. Her final call had gone out at 5:34 in the evening on the 15th. The signal had bounced off a cell tower in Studio City, right at the foot of the Hollywood Hills, and after that there was nothing. For a conscientious young woman who phoned her mother daily, that kind of total silence pointed in one terrible direction. Investigators went to the mall where her roommate claimed that she met the producer and pored over the security footage. They found her on tape, alone, buying clothes, including those heels, the receipt for which was sitting in her room, but the man who'd made the pitch never appeared on camera beside her. Her roommate filled in what the tapes couldn't: the Bond audition, the wardrobe instructions, the promise of a fortune. Unfortunately, Christy hadn't informed her roommate where exactly in the mall the two of them had met, though given that it was 2003, security camera coverage was still relatively minimal. There was one more detail that really showed that this wasn't legitimate at all. When detectives looked into it, they learned that no new James Bond film was actually in production. The audition she'd dressed for and the role she'd been promised had never existed in the first place. A press conference went out with her photo and a picture of her car, but the tapes and the timeline only deepened the worry, rather than pointing anywhere useful. Then the case cracked open from a somewhat unexpected direction, and this was definitely disheartening for anyone who had hoped to find her alive. As Christie's photo and a description of her car hit the news, a woman named Susan Murphy came forward with a story that gave detectives chills. She'd been approached at the very same Century City Mall by a man claiming to be a producer, and he'd told her she could be a Bond girl. He'd dangled a six-figure sum, and he'd given her the identical shopping list: white shirt, short black skirt, nylons, and stilettos. He gave her a place to meet near the corner of La Cienega and Santa Monica Boulevards. Murphy had shown up without the outfit on, and when the man realized it, his charm evaporated and he grabbed her. Her boyfriend, who had suspicions about the whole thing, was waiting in the car, and he jumped out, and the man bolted. This mysterious man had called himself Victor Thomas, but a search for that name went nowhere. Murphy sat down with a sketch artist and helped build a composite that investigators pushed out to the media. Detectives went back to the mall footage, found a man who matched the drawing, and Murphy confirmed it was him. All the while, on February 24th, Christie's car turned up, parked at a hotel, and left there by a man, though it offered nothing useful. The break came on February 25th. A parole officer saw the composite sketch on the news and recognized her own parolee. His name was Victor Paleologus, a man in his early 40s with a long and disturbing record. For all the supposed polish, the producer with Bond connections was an invention completely unmoored from anything he'd actually done in his life. In reality, Paleologus was a failed restaurateur who'd spent years faking the credentials that made his pitch sound legitimate. The year before, court records show, he'd been handed a sentence of 8 years and 8 months on charges that included passing fictitious checks, burglary, and an illicit offense against a woman. Perhaps most disturbingly of all, he'd walked out of prison just 26 days before Christie vanished, despite the chilling nature of that last particular offense. He lived near the spot where Murphy had been attacked, and both Murphy and her boyfriend picked him out of a photo lineup. And here's the thing that should have made him easy to find. He was already in custody. 2 days after Christie disappeared, Paleologus had been arrested, trying to steal a luxury car in Beverly Hills, and he was sitting in the county jail. Detectives interviewed him, and he flatly denied knowing anything about Christie Johnson whatsoever, and for a while, that left them stuck. Another tip pushed things forward and slowly tightened the grip around Paleologus. A real estate agent recognized the sketch as a client he'd shown around in early February, a man who'd toured roughly 10 houses. All of them clustered near the area where Christie's phone had last pinged, and the client had made one request the agent never forgot. He'd wanted to stand inside a bedroom and have the agent listen from elsewhere in the house to find out whether shouting could be heard through the walls. He'd framed it as a question about how well the place was insulated for sound, claiming that he was serious about wanting privacy. The real estate agent found it incredibly odd, but of course being odd in and of itself wasn't enough to trigger him to do anything more. Detectives searched all 10 properties and found nothing that connected any of them to Christie. Then, on March 3rd, a group of hikers in the Hollywood Hills came across the body of a young woman in a ravine. She was identified by a hibiscus tattoo on her lower back, and her hands and her ankles had been bound. The coroner estimated she'd been there for roughly 16 days, which placed her passing right around the evening of that last phone call. Unfortunately, the weather didn't cooperate, and the recent rain had accelerated the decomposition substantially. However, despite the elements not playing along, the cause was determined to be strangulation, with evidence of a head injury as well. The decay was advanced enough that investigators couldn't determine whether she'd been subjected to other forms of assault, and there was no evidence tying Paleologus to her body. What they had against him at this point was a pattern, and they needed a great deal more of it to make an airtight case. If they attempted to prosecute him on what they had at that moment, there was a very real risk he could be found not guilty, given the case needs to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. If that was the case, then double jeopardy rules would apply, and there'd be a serious chance that he would effectively get away with this crime. Detectives had a hunch that there were way more victims out there, and when they went looking for other women, the floodgates opened. 2 days after Christie was found, a woman who'd worked at a restaurant in the Century City Mall told police that Paleologus had approached her in late January. He came at her with the same Bond girl story and the same wardrobe instructions, and that the meeting he'd arranged had turned violent. By the end, investigators say something like 13 women came forward describing encounters that ran from unsettling to nearly fatal, and the trail stretched back well over a decade. Prosecutors would later lay it out in the sentencing documents as a near-continuous crime spree dating to 1989. That year, posing as a record company executive, he'd lured a 21-year-old to a hotel room, where, she said, he ambushed her with a rope and choked her. His ultimate goal of that attack wasn't known, because the moment he started choking her, she bit him with tremendous force and made her escape. He was acquitted of the most serious charges and pleaded guilty to false imprisonment, walking away with probation. The woman warned anyone who'd listen that he'd do it again and that someone would die. But sadly, no one listened. In 1996, he forced his way into the home of a woman he'd briefly dated and came at her with a ligature, and she drove him off with pepper spray. 3 weeks later, when authorities moved in to arrest, he barricaded himself inside a trailer with a hostage before surrendering. The hostage wasn't harmed, and Paleologus pleaded guilty to burglary and was handed probation again. Now I get why, in 1989, a court may have had some difficulty giving him a more serious sentence, because thankfully the woman fought back immediately. Proving what his intent actually was in that situation, beyond a reasonable doubt, would of course been somewhat difficult given her heroic defensive actions. However, this hostage-taking in 1996 seems like it should have been the moment the justice system said, "Put a fork in it, we're done here." This was a guy who attempted to strangle yet another woman, and when the cops came to get him, he took a hostage. The fact that he simply got probation for this, and was turned out back on the street to continue his reign of terror, is absolutely bizarre. In 1998, he approached a woman at a Hollywood bar as a Disney producer, scouting faces for a Bond promotion. He told her to wear a black miniskirt and heels to a closed set, then bound her ankles and tried to strangle her with a necktie. She thankfully got away before he could do the worst of what he had planned, and that one finally stuck, earning him some time in the slammer. One of the most unsettling accounts also came from 1998 from a woman who'd had a recurring role on a Star Trek series. She described being approached at a mall near Beverly Hills by a smooth, well-dressed man who introduced himself as a producer and floated the idea of putting her on a Bond poster. He told her to come to a house up in the Hollywood Hills, to park across the street, and to wait, saying he'd be watching from inside and would let her in when she arrived. He also told her to wear that same general outfit that he always told his potential victims to wear. She didn't trust it, and she turned up without the costume and brought along a friend who worked as a stuntman, just in case. They sat outside the house for about 20 minutes, no one ever came out, and eventually they drove away. She had no way of knowing how close she'd come, or that the same script she'd just walked out on would be run a few years later on a young woman who didn't get the chance to leave. In the end, he seemed to be rehearsing this sick act for over a decade, with only the names of the women he targeted changing and most of the rest staying the same. Personally, I suspect he did end up using a house in the area when he attacked Christie, but for whatever reason, the cops were never able to locate it. Paleologus was charged, with prosecutors signaling they'd seek the death penalty. His trial opened on July 13, 2006, and the prosecution had a problem, and they knew it. There was no forensic evidence, no confession, nothing physical linking him to Christie's death. Had the elements not taken their toll on Christie's body, the case may never have gotten to trial. But that wasn't the case here, and the defense decided to roll the dice. What the prosecution had were the women who had the misfortune of running into this disturbed monster over the course of the years. One after another, several of his earlier targets took the stand and described the same man running the same con. There was the producer act, the bond pitch, the costume request, and the rage when the fantasy didn't go his way. The deputy district attorney who tried the case said later that without those women, there likely would have been no case at all, and based on the evidence, I have to agree. After about 2 weeks of that testimony, the defense saw where it was heading, and the two sides struck a deal. Paleologus would admit to his crimes, and in exchange, the prosecution would take the big DP off the table. He pleaded guilty, and then, almost immediately, he tried to take it back, sending the judge an 11-page letter claiming he'd only agreed because he was sleep-deprived. The judge wasn't moved, and in September 2006, Paleologus was sentenced to 25 years to life. He kept insisting he was innocent, kept maintaining he'd never posed as anyone or forced himself on anyone. He later tried to appeal on the grounds that his own lawyer had pressured him into the plea, but the courts turned him down. For all the noise he made about his innocence, the case against Victor Paleologus had been built almost entirely by the women who'd refused to stay quiet. It was the ones who got away and remembered every detail who were able to secure justice for Christie. It was also the women who were ignored for years, who were shattered to see this monster end up with probation or a light sentence, who turned up in force. Christie Johnson would have turned 22 the week after she disappeared, and ultimately, I have to conclude that the entire system failed her. She chased her dream and thought this meeting was potentially her big break, but little did she know, she was walking into the clutches of a predator who kept being turned loose on society. As a bit of a postscript on this case, I have to question whether Paleologus may have been a serial killer. He'd been attempting to do what he did to Christie for over a decade, and just kept getting away with it, even though the women escaped. The women he was known to target weren't on the outskirts of life. They were all women whose absences would be noticed. I can't help but think he may have targeted more vulnerable groups as well. Groups that the cops are notorious for not investigating, such as addicts or street-level escorts. That said, I have to admit that there's nothing to suggest that these women were part of his victim profile. I just find it difficult to accept that he only succeeded in achieving his sick goal once in the entire decade he was actively hunting for victims. Anyway, even if he wasn't a serial killer, he was a convicted serial predator and a ticking time bomb regardless, and it's somewhat shocking to me that he was even out on the streets. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy with my usual reminder to hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell. Also, don't forget that you can suggest a true crime case in the comments as well, either something that's solved or unsolved. Somewhere in the piney woods of southern Mississippi, there's a patch of dirt that two grieving parents once sifted through themselves. They were looking for a bullet the authorities had never gone out to find, and they found it. What that small piece of metal told them turned what was officially a tidy case into one of the most unsettling, unsolved mysteries the state has ever produced. Picayune sits in Pearl River County, down near the bottom of Mississippi, and Norman Ladner Jr. was born there on the 29th of May, 1972. By the summer of 1989, he was 17, and by most accounts he was well liked and popular with his peers. Norman Sr. and Charlotte ran a small general store in town, and the family also owned a sprawling piece of land. It was somewhere around 122 acres of pasture and thick forest, and that land was Norman's second home. He fished it and hunted it, and he knew its tree lines and its low spots, the way you only know ground you've walked since you were small. His parents trusted him out there alone, with one expectation that mattered more than any other. Norman was to be home by 7, and he never broke it, and that simple fact is the first thing that should bother you about what happened next. On the 21st of August, 1989, Norman told his father he was going hunting on their plot of land. Nothing about that was unusual, and he picked up his rifle, walked off into the family's acreage like he'd done 100 times before, and the day went on. Then 7 o'clock came and went, and Norman didn't return home as expected. For a boy who never missed that deadline, that fact would mean everything, and Norm Sr. went out looking for his son immediately. He searched the property as the light failed, working through the pasture and into the trees, and after more than an hour of it, he found him. Norman was lying on the ground with a single gunshot wound to the head. When his father knelt and touched him, Norm Jr. was already cold, which meant he'd fallen hours earlier, not long after he set out. Whatever happened in those woods had happened early in the day, and his body had lain there while the family went about its business, unaware. The Ladners called for help, and then they waited a very long time given the severity of what happened. It was somewhere around 10 o'clock that night before the law finally arrived at the property, hours after a father had carried the worst news of his life out of those trees. The law, in this case, came in the form of Pearl River County Sheriff Ulmer Lawrence Lumpkin. And as a total aside, if you made up a character by that name for a novel or a screenplay, I feel like audiences would think that it was a little too much. By most descriptions, the sheriff's investigation was thin to the point of being almost theoretical. Lumpkin came to the scene and he looked at the body, then declared it all a big accident. Importantly, he didn't collect any evidence whatsoever from the scene, and most controversially, he didn't even look for the bullet. The county coroner reportedly told Norman's father he was 90% sure it had been an accidental shooting as well. Then, within roughly a day, the finding hardened into something else entirely. The official ruling came back that Ladner did it to himself, and the coroner signed off on it. Almost nobody who actually knew Norman believed it, and by every account he was a happy, settled teenager, with nothing in his life that pointed toward such an act. There was no note, and the people closest to him couldn't tell a story that made the ruling fit, since he had no signs of any internal or external turmoil whatsoever. I will say, of course, to play devil's advocate for a moment, that since this case was never really properly investigated, there may have been more there, but there's no evidence of it. And then there were the physical details that the findings simply didn't account for, the sort of stuff you seem to see happen a lot in these small town cases. By the coroner's account, the fatal wound was a close contact shot that entered at the right temple and passed out the left. But there was also a laceration on the top of Norman's head, a cut more than an inch long, sitting up near the crown, that couldn't be accounted for at all. When pressed, the sheriff offered an explanation that strained belief, suggesting the cut probably came from Norman's head, striking a tree root at the scene as he fell. Now here's the thing. If the scene had been properly investigated, there may have been some sort of evidence to suggest this. But as far as I can tell from my research, this was just a weird theory that Lumpkin tossed out that wasn't backed by evidence whatsoever. You would think that if Norm's head struck a tree root so severely and in such a way, there may have been some sort of biological material on the tree root. Instead, we don't even have proof that a tree root existed in that spot where Norm fell, which would clearly cause a major problem with this hypothesis. To me, it sounds like Lumpkin was just shooting from the hip, wanting to shut this case down as fast as possible. Whether that was due to laziness, incompetence, a genuine belief in his position, or something more sinister, has been argued about for almost 4 decades now. Norman Sr. kept circling back to the same problem with that bizarre hypothesis. The cut sat right at the peak of his son's head, and a boy who'd taken a shot to the temple and dropped straight back had no reason to come down on the crown. And there was the matter of the bullet, the thing that by any standard should have anchored the entire investigation. According to the family, the weapon was never dusted for fingerprints, and no real effort was made to recover the round that had ended their son's life. Picture that for a second. A 17-year-old is found shot on his family's property, and the investigators don't lift a print off the weapon or dig around for the bullet. Perhaps the most basic question in any shooting, "Where's the bullet?" was left for 2 heartbroken parents to answer on their own, and so answer it they did. Unable to accept the ruling and getting nothing from the people they theoretically trusted to investigate, Norm and Charlotte began working the case themselves. They went back to the spot where their son had been found, and sifted through the soil where his head had rested. A couple of inches down in the dirt, they found the bullet. It carried dried blood and a single hair, and to them it looked as though someone had pressed it into the ground. Now you're about to see why the cops should have been the ones to find this bullet, and why chains of custody are an important thing. Then came the detail that's kept this case alive for more than 30 years. The bullet didn't match Norman's weapon. By their account, it was the wrong size, longer than anything the chamber of his rifle was bored to hold. A round that doesn't fit the weapon at the scene isn't a small inconsistency by any means, and it raised questions about why the bullet was never found. The Ladners handed the bullet to a state ballistics expert, and by the time it came back, they'd lost faith in the whole exercise. The expert couldn't even say for certain whether the round had come from Norman's weapon, but there was a complicating factor. The parents became convinced that the bullet handed back to them wasn't the one they'd sent off in the first place. Somewhere in the chain of custody, they believed, their evidence had been quietly swapped for something less inconvenient. This, of course, is a very serious allegation, and many at the time thought that it was completely off the wall. But as you'll see, there was more. Norman's wallet was eventually found, but it had been cleaned out. By one account, it had held around $140, and the cash was gone, along with his identification. Last I checked, theft isn't usually on the menu when someone does something like this to themselves. But then the Ladners found the device, and here's where this case turns incredibly unusual. Roughly 300 yards from where Norman had died, there was a crude, homemade contraption that looked like a makeshift radio. The family didn't know what to make of it, so a neighbor pointed them toward someone who would. A former narcotics agent took a look and gave them an answer that recast the whole picture and suggested the hunting grounds had been used for something far darker. By his read, it was the kind of low-range signaling device drug traffickers use to guide aircraft, a beacon to line up a plane and tell it where to drop a load. If there was smuggling equipment tucked into the back of that property, then the woods Norman wandered every day weren't as empty as they looked. The emptied wallet starts to read less like a simple robbery than like someone working to muddy what had really happened. A 17-year-old who knew that land better than anyone could very easily have walked into the middle of something he was never meant to see. I want to be careful here because this is the point where a case can tip into pure guesswork and speculation. The device was identified, but the smuggling theory was never proven in any court, and state authorities waved it off as unimportant. Still, it sat there alongside everything else, and it's hard to look at the whole pile of bizarre evidence and just call it a simple run of coincidences. If the family had any doubt they were poking at something dangerous, a stranger removed it. While they were at the coroner's office trying to challenge the ruling, Charlotte was approached by a man she didn't know. He got her alone on the pretext of having something to say about her son, and what he actually delivered was a warning. He told her, in so many words, to leave the case closed, and she was gently reminded that she had other children. She was told that she should think about raising them and let this go, because she was never going to find the person responsible anyway. Then he walked off, and she never saw him again, or learned his identity, or even if what he said had any truth whatsoever behind it. The case drew enough attention to reach national television the year after Norman died, and despite an appearance on Unsolved Mysteries, still nothing shook loose. Years later, his missing identification, the same identification that had vanished from his emptied wallet in the Mississippi woods, allegedly turned up far away in New York City. How it traveled more than 1,000 miles from a patch of dirt in Picayune to the other end of the country, nobody has ever explained. That said, though, it remains unclear if this is just a local rumor that made it online in the decades following his death, or whether this is actual fact. At any rate, I can't find any primary source reporting on it, so I would treat it as improbable or speculative at best. Personally, I find this element of the case doubtful, but it pops up enough that I felt I had to address it at the very least. Norm Sr. and Charlotte spent the rest of their lives pushing against that ruling that Norm Jr. did it to himself. The official file, for what it's worth, was closed a long time ago, but the mystery of what happened to Norman Ladner remains. Personally, I feel like there's too much smoke here for there to not be a fire. But ultimately, the lack of a proper investigation makes any real firm conclusions impossible. And given Charlotte's encounter in the coroner's office and some of the general strangeness surrounding this case, many have argued that was a feature, not a bug. On June 8, 1806, an 80-year-old man lay dying in his Richmond home, his body ravaged by 2 weeks of unrelenting agony. But this wasn't an ordinary old man. He was one of the founding fathers. He'd signed the Declaration of Independence, and he'd personally mentored many great men, including Thomas Jefferson, John Marshall, and Henry Clay. And now, with his final reserves of strength, George Wythe delivered a self-diagnosis that none of his attending physicians were willing to accept. He looked at the men gathered around his bed and told the men that he had been poisoned. To understand why Wythe's death sent shockwaves across the nation, you have to understand who he was. Born in 1726 in Elizabeth City County, Virginia, Wythe rose from a modest planter family to become one of the most consequential legal minds of the 18th century. He studied law under his uncle and was admitted to practice before the Virginia General Court at the remarkably young age of 20. He went on to serve multiple terms in the House of Burgesses, acting as its clerk for nearly a full decade. He represented Virginia at the Second Continental Congress and became the first of 7 Virginians to sign the Declaration of Independence. But Wythe's legacy wasn't built on politics alone. In 1779, he was appointed professor of law at the College of William and Mary, the first such position at any American institution. His students shaped the country, and Jefferson himself credited Wythe as the man who made him an honest and powerful advocate, both for his clients and for his country as a whole. John Marshall went on to become arguably the most influential Chief Justice in American history, while Henry Clay became one of the most powerful senators the country ever produced. By 1805, Wythe's household in Richmond consisted of 4 people. There was Wythe himself, still serving as a judge at 80. There was Lydia Broadnax, a freedwoman who'd been his housekeeper and cook for over 20 years. There was also Michael Brown, a freed teenager Wythe was personally educating. And then there was George Wythe Sweeney, Wythe's grandnephew, sent to live with the old judge in the hopes that some of his character might rub off. Sweeney was 17 or 18, and he was a disaster to say the least. He drank, gambled, and ran up debts at the taverns and gambling dens clustered around Richmond's seediest areas. When his money ran out, he started stealing, pilfering rare books from Wythe's library and selling them at public auction. Then he graduated to forging Wythe's signature on bank checks, at least 6 by the spring of 1806. Wythe, ever the optimist about human nature, forgave the thefts and even revised his will to ensure Sweeney would still inherit despite his personal crimes against him. Unfortunately, the will contained a fateful provision that would lay the groundwork for what happened next. If Michael Brown died before reaching full age, his share of the large inheritance would pass directly to Sweeney. On the evening of May 24, 1806, Wythe ate a light supper of strawberries and milk. The next morning, a Sunday, he took his usual frugal breakfast with coffee prepared by Broadnax. Brown and Broadnax also drank from the same pot. Only Sweeney, who prepared the coffee, didn't partake, and within an hour, all three were violently ill, doubled over with stomach cramps and severe nausea. Sweeney, despite having likely had everything else the others in the household had besides the tainted coffee, was totally fine. Richmond's most prominent physicians rushed to the home, and they initially suspected cholera, perhaps brought on by the strawberries from the night before. Wythe rejected this diagnosis immediately and insisted to anyone who would listen that he'd been poisoned by his grandnephew. The circumstantial evidence began piling up fast. 2 days later, Sweeney walked into the Bank of Richmond and tried to cash a $100 check bearing Wythe's signature. The teller, knowing Wythe was on his deathbed, contacted authorities. It wasn't the first forged check Sweeney had passed. When a constable arrested Sweeney, he felt 2 paper-wrapped parcels in the young man's pockets, but for whatever reason, he didn't confiscate them. Days later, a packet of arsenic turned up in the garden adjacent to the jail, as if thrown from a cell window. Inside Wythe's home, the situation grew dire. Broadnax slowly recovered, though the poison would leave her nearly blind for life. Michael Brown wasn't so fortunate, and he died on June 1st, just 1 week after drinking the tainted coffee. Upon hearing the news, Wythe summoned his attorney Edmund Randolph and signed a codicil disinheriting Sweeney entirely, redirecting his share to Sweeney's siblings. And you're going to want to keep Randolph's name in mind, because he would play a very bizarre role in the criminal trial, especially given his tangential involvement in the case. The old founding father lingered another week in excruciating pain, and on June 8, 1806, this founder of the Republic had slipped into history once and for all. Wythe's funeral at St. John's Church in Richmond was the largest Virginia had ever seen. Businesses shut down across the city, and thousands of mourners lined Main Street as the procession wound from the Capitol to the burial site. Newspaper coverage of his mysterious death captivated American readers throughout the summer and fall. President Jefferson's grief for his fallen law professor was profound and lasting. He called Wythe the purest character he'd ever known, described him as his best friend, and characterized the suspect as possessing a depravity previously known only in fables. Those close to Jefferson noted that his personality seemed to darken in the months that followed, even as his political fortunes remained strong. Sweeney was arrested on June 18th and charged with a number of offenses related to the poisoning. In the court of public opinion, Sweeney was already guilty as charged, and what happened next would ignite a firestorm of rage. Virginia Attorney General Philip Norborne Nicholas led the prosecution in what most expected to be a swift conviction. Witnesses testified that Sweeney had asked friends about procuring poison weeks before the incident. A friend said Sweeney had sought advice on obtaining ratsbane, a common arsenic-based rodent poison. The Richmond mayor, who took it upon himself to do some amateur sleuthing, found arsenic powder in a shed on Wythe's property. Doctors who performed autopsies on both victims also found severe stomach inflammation consistent with arsenic, again pointing to the nefarious Sweeney. But the prosecution's case had a fatal weakness that had nothing to do with the evidence itself. The most important witness was Lydia Broadnax, as she was the only innocent person who had been in the kitchen that Sunday morning. She'd watched Sweeney handle the coffee pot and toss a small white paper into the fire. She'd drunk from that same pot and nearly died. According to the later account of George Wythe Munford, the son of one of Wythe's law students and a man who knew Broadnax personally, she'd also witnessed something damning. Sweeney was rummaging through Wythe's desk and inspecting the will the day before the poisoning. Her testimony should have easily sealed Sweeney's fate, but judges Joseph Prentice and John Tyler Sr. ruled that Broadnax couldn't testify. Under Virginia law, black people, regardless of their status, were prohibited from giving evidence against white defendants in criminal proceedings. Broadnax's first-hand account was excluded entirely, and prosecutors attempted to get around this using white witness hearsay. However, even white witnesses who'd heard her story couldn't relay it, because second-hand testimony originating from a black source was also inadmissible. The defense was surprisingly formidable. 2 lawyers volunteered to represent a man almost everyone in Richmond believed to be guilty. William Wirt, a brilliant young attorney, saw the high-profile case as a career-making opportunity. The other was Edmund Randolph, Wythe's own longtime friend and personal attorney, and perhaps the last person you'd expect to represent the accused poisoner. Randolph had fallen on hard times after resigning from George Washington's cabinet amid a political scandal and needed a courtroom victory to rebuild his reputation. Under cross-examination, the medical witnesses hedged their bets. One doctor conceded the symptoms could potentially be attributed to causes other than arsenic. Another physician admitted they hadn't performed the definitive chemical tests available at the time. On September 8th, after deliberating for only a matter of minutes, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty. And to be fair, without the evidence of Broadnax, finding Sweeney guilty beyond a reasonable doubt would have basically been an impossibility. The Richmond Enquirer explained the acquittal bluntly, noting that the strongest testimony had been kept from the jury because it came from a black witness. Notably, no one questioned the veracity of what Broadnax was saying. This was simply a disturbing technicality based upon an unjust law that existed at the time. The story was reprinted in newspapers across the country, and public outrage was considerable. Sweeney was convicted on 2 forgery counts the very next day, but the sentence was never carried out. He left Virginia shortly after, and reportedly ended up in Tennessee, where he was eventually convicted of horse theft and spent several years in prison. However, there's an extremely bitter irony here that's hard to ignore, if we're going to assume that Sweeney was guilty. And just to be clear, based upon all evidence, including the evidence of Broadnax that was excluded, I personally believe that Sweeney was guilty. But let's get back to the irony of the result itself. Decades before the trial, Wythe and Jefferson had worked together to revise Virginia's legal code. They'd even discussed changing the rules governing black testimony, but Jefferson and Wythe decided the public wasn't ready for black witnesses against white criminals. The very legal framework that Wythe helped build became the instrument that let the man who almost certainly poisoned him walk free. In the end, Virginia didn't change these laws until 1867 under a Reconstruction government. Lydia Broadnax, the woman who could have delivered justice for her employer and friend, never got to speak in a courtroom. She lived out her remaining years nearly blind, struggling financially, until President Jefferson personally interceded and provided her a modest income to live on.